a todos y todas desde Copenhague y bienvenidos al webinar Introducción al financiamiento, climático y arreglos institucionales, organizado por la Alianza entre el Programa de Naciones Unidas para el Medio Ambiente, PENUMA y DTU, que es la Universidad Tecnológica de Dinamarca. Antes de empezar, me gustaría informar a todos los participantes de que esta sesión está siendo grabada. Por otro lado, informarles un poco sobre el webinario del día de hoy. Este webinar es el primer workshop de una serie de talleres sobre financiamiento climático que se iniciaron desde ayer y culminarán mañana bajo el marco del proyecto CAE Panamá financiado por NDC Partnership. Antes de todo, me gustaría agradecer por su apoyo en estos meses a la Dirección de Cambio Climático del Ministerio de Ambiente de Panamá y la Oficina Regional para Latinoamérica y el Caribe, ROLAC, de UNED. Mi nombre es Begoña Gutiérrez y trabajo como asistente de investigación en UNED DTU Partnership. Y hoy voy a ser la moderadora del workshop. Solamente un par de datos técnicos antes de pasar al contenido principal de nuestro seminario del día de hoy. Va a durar aproximadamente unas 3 horas, con una sesión de preguntas y respuestas y actividades de grupo al final de este seminario. Referente a la sesión de preguntas y respuestas, nos pueden enviar en cualquier momento en el chat general o directamente a mí sus preguntas y después de las presentaciones los vamos a contestar. Ahora les quería enseñar la agenda del día de hoy para darles una información de cómo va a tratar. Y como pueden ver, después de las 2 presentaciones vamos a tener una sesión de preguntas y respuestas, como mencioné anteriormente. Después tendremos una pausa de 5 minutos y posteriormente actividades de grupo, que serán repartidos en 3 distintos grupos en los cuales se van a discutir los mismos temas, que se presentarán más adelante. Para estas sesiones de grupo se van a crear 3 breakout rooms y se van a asignar de forma aleatoria y equitativa a los participantes en los diferentes breakout rooms. Y estos breakout rooms se van a crear durante la pausa. Por último, tendremos una sesión final, cuando volvamos a la sesión inicial, después de los breakout rooms, donde los moderadores de cada breakout room pondrán en común los puntos más importantes que se hayan discutido en sus sesiones. Ahora, me gustaría presentar brevemente a los panelistas del webinar de hoy. Jorge Hinojosa va a ser el primer panelista. En UNED-DTU, él está trabajando en proyectos de políticas y finanzas climáticas que responden al Acuerdo de París, involucrando investigaciones internacionales y estudio de casos. Nuestra segunda panelista de hoy es Merete Billum. Ella es la jefa de sección Modelos de Negocio y Finanzas en UNED-DTU. Merete gestiona diferentes proyectos y participa en actividades de preparación, creando capacidad en los países en desarrollo para la acción climática y la financiación, lo que incluye permitir que los países accedan a la financiación del Fondo Verde para el Clima. Ahora, les quería mencionar, antes de dar la palabra a Jorge, que es nuestro primer panelista, él va a hablar en español, pero nuestra segunda panelista, Merete, ella va a hablar en inglés. Y para que ustedes puedan entender, hay una opción, si lo pueden ver en su barra, con las diferentes funciones, que pone Interpretación, tal como lo ven aquí en la pantalla. Así que les pediría que por favor seleccionen en español. Cuando Merete hable, ustedes lo van a escuchar en español. Y después de mencionar estos detalles técnicos, me gustaría darle la palabra a Jorge. Jorge, te cedo la palabra.
Sí, muchas gracias, Begoña. Voy a compartir mi pantalla para los puntos principales de ayer. Entonces, yo lo que quiero comenzar haciendo es una recapitulación de lo que hablamos ayer, que estuvimos exponiendo mi colega Mirko y yo, que fue una fase inicial más conceptual para ponernos todos en la misma página sobre financiamiento climático. Y vimos varios temas. Lo que quiero hacer ahora es un resumen, pues porque ahora vamos a profundizar sobre el financiamiento climático. Estuvimos hablando primero de la importancia de la transparencia de la Convención de Cambio Climático y del Acuerdo de París, de cómo estos requerimientos internacionales y cómo estas guías para todos los países y los países en desarrollo en específico están dándonos una pauta de cómo reportar, cómo tener un sistema de transparencia y cómo llegar. Entonces, es importante, como veíamos, tener un sistema de transparencia climática para poder tener todos los sectores del gobierno nacional, de los gobiernos locales, en un mismo entendido, para el sector público y privado, poder contar con la misma información y poder tener un sistema de reporte también hacia los demás países, porque también los donantes, los países desarrollados, van a estar exigiendo esta transparencia y van a querer, cuando van a darnos un instrumento financiero a los países en desarrollo, cualquier tipo de instrumento de los que vamos a estar hablando, va a ser muy importante tener esto. Y por otra parte, estuvimos hablando de las definiciones diferentes que hay de financiamiento climático. Vemos que hay retos todavía de alineación entre las definiciones, porque tenemos por una parte simplemente las definiciones del Climate Policy Initiative que veíamos y de la ONU, que están más alineadas, que incluye todas las inversiones climáticas que son de mitigación, adaptación, vulnerabilidad. Todas estas inversiones van a formar parte del financiamiento climático. Esa es la definición básica que tenemos, es la más alineada que tenemos ahora. Por otra parte, se ve como los países mismos, como veíamos los ejemplos de Maldivas, México, Colombia, han optado por tener también sus definiciones de financiamiento climático nacional, alineadas a sus políticas nacionales. Entonces, ellos van diciendo qué sectores sí forman más parte para ellos de su financiamiento climático, de mitigación, adaptación, transversal, y cómo van cambiando estas cosas. Ahora, el reto más importante que tenemos es que, bueno, tenemos la definición y desde el sector público lo entendemos de esta manera más internacional y estamos tratando de que el sector privado, las taxonomías en los países, como es en México, Colombia, Costa Rica, en varios países que ya está pasando en la región, también el avance con las instituciones financieras, se estén alineando a estas definiciones, ¿verdad? Con el fin de que después se pueda tener un sistema centralizado, ¿verdad? Y también hablábamos de algo importante, que es cómo los donantes, los países desarrollados, las instituciones de cooperación internacional, los multilaterales, están percibiendo el financiamiento climático, ellos que están dando los fondos. Porque si ellos nos van a dar una cooperación técnica, un instrumento financiero de los que vamos a estar hablando, también tienen sus pautas y requerimientos para decir qué proyecto de qué programa sí es financiamiento climático, cuál es la puntuación de financiamiento climático que tiene este proyecto. ¿Es 2, es 1 o es 0? Como vamos a ver con los marcadores de Río y todos estos temas de la actividad de hoy. Entonces, es muy importante la actividad de hoy, de más tarde, porque la percepción y la puntuación de qué tan climático es este fondo, esta inversión, va a ser primordial para avanzar entre las instituciones y los sectores público y privado también, ¿no? Porque tenemos, por ejemplo, como hablamos en los casos, varios proyectos y programas que van del gobierno nacional al local, que puede ser, por ejemplo, uno de transporte, pero es público-privado, que es transporte eléctrico, y decimos, bueno, pero tiene fondos de 3 donantes, ¿verdad? Y unos son internacionales y unos son nacionales y unos son más pequeños que otros. Entonces aquí alinear estas cosas en un mismo sistema va a ser muy importante. Después también hablamos de los arreglos institucionales y los sistemas MRV, el sistema de monitoreo, reporte y verificación. ¿Por qué es importante tenerlo? No solo porque, claro, como parte de la transparencia internacional del artículo 13 del Acuerdo de París y de todo lo que vimos, tener un sistema de MRV de financiamiento climático va a ser fundamental para poder reportar, pero también para poder tener un orden en todos estos flujos que están entrando y saliendo de financiamiento climático en los países. En nuestros países que están entrando fondos de distintas formas de cooperación, o simplemente hay unos fondos que son más locales, también mantener un sistema actualizado de cuáles son y cómo son de financiamiento climático. Estos arreglos institucionales también entre los diferentes comités o cómo los ministerios colaboran o quién tiene por ejemplo, la coordinación de si los fondos son internacionales o si son locales. A veces son dos diferentes ministerios y esa colaboración a veces no es tan fácil regularla porque los fondos de multilaterales pueden entrar por finanzas o hacienda, después los de agencias bilaterales pueden entrar por cooperación internacional de relaciones exteriores y ya tenemos ahí muchas cosas con las cuales se nos puede ir perdiendo la información, ¿no? Entonces la importancia de llegar a un sistema RB, facilitar el flujo y la transparencia de esta información de financiamiento es algo de lo que se habló. Vimos ejemplos, por ejemplo, que en Colombia, en Perú, se está avanzando con el sistema MRB específicamente de financiamiento climático y cómo se está definiendo que el sector privado y público tengan un nivel de reporte y monitoreo de la información alineados, la asociación de bancos tenga una participación en las reuniones y que se pueda tener un diálogo de qué es lo que ellos como empresas privadas, bancos también perciben que está haciendo financiamiento climático o simplemente cómo se les puede pedir esa información porque a veces no está muy disponible, ¿verdad? Entonces, como parte de la coordinación de todo este sistema de base de datos que puede estar en línea y ser transparente para todos acceder, es importante tener bien claro todo lo que vamos a estar definiendo estos días, ¿verdad? Entonces, estos son los mensajes principales con los que me quedo del día de ayer. Ahora, lo importante de la actividad de hoy va a ser enfocarnos totalmente en financiamiento climático, como lo va a hacer mi colega Merete, y enfocarnos en cómo son esas puntuaciones, qué herramientas de mapeo tenemos, entonces, para poder avanzar en conjunto. Y al final del día, pues en la actividad de grupo, vamos a hacer una discusión entre todos los grupos para tener pues una conclusión más avanzada y un aprendizaje. Bueno, entonces yo aquí quiero pasar ya a la siguiente sesión. Voy a pasar a que mi colega Merete pueda comenzar su presentación.
Muchas gracias, Jorge, por esta presentación introductoria. Ahora le voy a dar la palabra a mi compañera Merete.
Good morning, everyone, and I'm sorry for my language. I have to start by saying that it's a great pleasure to be with you this morning in Panama, and I hope and trust that the translator will work fine with the translation so that you will get the essence of what I'm saying in the next 1 hour or so. First of all, you already heard a little bit about me, but I just want to add that I have a background, as mentioned, in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Denmark, and I have been the Danish representative in the Green Climate Fund, as well as in the Council of GEF, the Global Environment Facility. I have also worked as the chair of OECD DAC Environment, and since we are going to talk a little bit about some OECD tools today, I just wanted to let you know that. So some of my experience that I will share here and some of my thoughts and information and knowledge comes from also these particular representation tasks I've had in the past. So why are we talking about mapping climate finance and support received? So let's say the first and foremost is, of course, that all countries, all parties need to comply with the recording requirements in the UNFCCC. You heard about that yesterday. I believe my colleague Mirko talked a lot about how the Paris Agreement has made new rules, new obligations in the enhanced transparency framework. And with that, there are some even more diligent reporting requirements to the convention. But of course, there are many other benefits and many other ideas behind and rationale behind trying to map the finance. Of course, we can use it to follow up and report on what is actually happening, what is received. And then you can also identify if there's something that has not been utilized, some funding sources that haven't been pursued, or some funding that is going through the system which is not really reaching where it's supposed to reach. You can also use this to verify and evaluate all the information you are getting from a variety of sources. It can be international sources of information and national sources of information, and you can try to piece the picture together on what is the climate finance in the country of Panama. You can also learn from various experiences that have been that you have gained through using a variety of financial instruments. So by mapping this, you're better equipped to learn those lessons and to share those lessons amongst yourselves. And then, of course, it improves the confidence, it improves transparency, and improves accountability, which are key elements of a democracy and key elements of making this information available and informing everybody to improve the picture, so to speak. And then, as that, it also improves the understanding of how the support is utilized, where is the money going, not just where it's coming from, but also where it's going, where is it being spent, local government, national government, what ministries, etc. And you can also use it to analyze whether this support is really effective and whether the distribution is really effective. And then, of course, all of this can also facilitate the development of certain policies that would even enhance your access to climate finance and make sure that you have even more support going through the national budget and to the private sector and civil society from climate finance institutions. So there's a lot of different elements to why we are going about this. But of course, first and foremost, you can say you are trying to comply with the reporting requirements. And some of the examples I will share today also come from the reporting to the convention. But there are many more, you can say, good benefits of mapping climate finance. Now, there are certain existing global databases that you can access. This is one of them. It's called Aid Atlas. You can see the link at the very bottom in the left-hand corner. We can actually even click it if we want to, but maybe we shouldn't do it today in order to not make this online meeting more complicated than it is. But this Aid Atlas, you can very easily access your own country. You can see what is the development assistance to Panama, and you can also see it within a range of sectors, and you can get even more details around this aid. However, a lot of this data that is in this website comes from the main source, which is OECD. So if we look at the next slide, you will see that this source, the OECD source, is really the main global database on development cooperation, on development funding, including climate finance or climate support. It has a big database behind it. When you access this link that is there in the left-hand corner, this goes to a general website. But inside that, if you go for the yellow part that we have marked here in these slides, you will get a lot more detailed data that are almost like Excel sheets, like you can see on the right-hand side. And this data you can organize in a variety of ways. And you can try to see a decade-long support that has been received. You can see just 1 year if you want to see that. You can see, of course, the country. You can see also a variety of sectors, etc. So all the parameters that are listed there, the year, the provider, the amounts, the sector, the subsector, the financial instrument, and the short description of what it is, you can see all of that in this very, very key base of information. But there are, of course, also some criticism to this database. all of the data here comes from OECD countries. It's an OECD database, meaning the industrialized countries. So it's not all countries in the world that is reporting here. It is the OECD members that are required to do it, and they are doing this, and you can find all that data. So there are certain limitations to this. There is a lot of other finance going on in the world. You can talk about remittances from overseas overseas nationals that are sending back money. You can talk about private sector finance. You can talk about those who are transferring climate finance who are not OECD members, like China or India or others who are also still investing in countries all over the world. So there's a lot of finance that is not in the statistics, but the OECD countries are in the statistics. There's also a good effort to make sure that this statistics is cleaned for the part of the funding that goes through multilateral sources. So some of this finance goes to, let's say, World Bank or Inter-American Development Bank before it may reach Panama. And there's a cleanup in the statistics here, trying to get a better picture of what will really reach Panama, both from the multilateral sources and the bilateral sources, to make sure that this statistics is more solid. So I will encourage you to perhaps in the coming days access this data if you want to know a little bit more. But there are, as I said, limitations to the data. OECD is also publishing a few publications. You can see a picture of one here, which is talking about climate-related development finance. And they do that almost every year leading up to the COP, the Conference of the Parties. They make a little statistics that tries to say how much of this is climate finance. Now, how do they find out of all of these large sum of money, how do they find out what is climate related? They do that through something called the Rio Markers. So the next slide here, we are trying to show what is the Rio Markers system and say a little bit about that. We will get more in depth with this in a short while. So the Rio Marker system is used for all the financial contributions labeled ODA, or Official Development Assistance. And this is, as I said, all the development cooperation, all the development support given to developing countries. Now, the marker system was invented as a policy marker. So for all the programs, all the support given, the donors, the OECD members, were asked to mark it simply with a policy marker, all of the programs, and state whether there was an environment content, or rather a content that was part of the Rio Conventions that was established in '92. So that's the Convention on Biodiversity, the Convention on Climate Change, the Convention on Desertification, etc. So it was invented as a policy marker, not as a tool to calculate how much finance is climate relevant, for instance. But as it has developed, it has actually become more than a policy marker, but that was not the intention with this. Now, what you are marking is, of course, whether there is an objective that is related to environmental issues. And I will go a little later into more details, but broadly speaking, if you look at the decision tree or question tree on the left-hand side, the first question is, what are the objectives stated in the program or in the project that you are trying to report to OECD and that you have to mark? So if you are asking that there is an objective in this project or program that are eligible for a Rio marker, then you say yes or you say no. If you say no, there will not be any marker. It can be simply a 0. That means it's not targeting anything related to climate change. If you say yes, there are 2 variations of marking. There's the 1 and the 2. And the 1 is a significant marker. That means that there is a certain element of, let's say, climate change in this program. Whereas the principle means that this is a dedicated climate change program. It means that it really has this as the main purpose to address climate change either as a mitigation or adaptation or as both. So those are the markers, the 0, the 1, and the 2. And you can see in the box on the left that a specific definition of what are those markers. As I put at the bottom of that box, the countries, it was intended as a policy marker, as I said, but nowadays countries use a variety of percentages to estimate the climate content, depending on whether they have marked it 0 or 1 or 2. If it's marked 0, of course, there will be no definition of a share that was spent on climate change. But if it's marked significant, some donors are saying, let's say 40% could be of this program could be about climate change. Whereas if it's marked principal, it would be 100% climate finance or climate finance relevant. These percentages are not stipulated by OECD. Every single donor can decide on how they will mark it. So some donors will say, as I show here, 40%, like the European Union. Others would say 50 or 60 or maybe even 100. Or others will say 20. So it's really not stipulated in the OECD system how you will calculate the finance contribution, because this was intended only as a policy marker. I hope this is clear, but we'll get back to it a little later. Let's continue by looking at what are your choice of tools then. Now you know a little bit about the Rio Markers. So if you want to do a very quick review of the budget and the programs that you have, you could use the Rio Markers. You could even go to the OECD database and try to see what have been mapped as development finance towards the Rio conventions for Panama. So that would be quite easy. But you could also use the Rio Markers on your own side, on the Panama side, not looking at the OECD side, but look at what you receive and try to quite quickly map the development finance you have received using that same principle of the Rio Markers. And you would then be able to verify that with what you have found in the OECD statistics. So that would be a quick review. But there's also the opportunity of doing something more in-depth. And that is called a climate public expenditure and institutional review. It's a concept I think many of you who come from ministries of finance know about. I'm sure you're doing public expenditure reviews at a regular basis of a variety of themes and sectors. So this is one which is a little bit more focused on climate change, but it's also focusing a little bit more on the policy side and also on the institutional side. So not just the expenditures, but also policies and institutional aspects. Normally, these public expenditure reviews that ministries of finance are doing are one-off exercises. So you do it once and you go through the whole thing, look at everything that is in the public expenditures, and you may look also at the public revenues, and you may do that once. Maybe you want to repeat it a little later, maybe after a couple of years, you repeat the same exercise to see if there's any change. But you can also do something which is more tailored to the country context, and that establish a more permanent system using still the thinking of the climate public expenditure and institutional review. I'll get back to that in a short while, but this just to show you that there's a difference between doing something a little bit more quick and dirty and doing something which is more in depth and that can also institutionalize in Panama a way of mapping development finance for the future. If we go back to the Rio Markers, just to talk a little bit about that. The Rio Markers, as I mentioned, was both used for mitigation and adaptation marking. So this is just trying to explain what will determine whether you are marking something for mitigation. And this is the definitions that comes from OECD DAC, Rio Markers. So an activity needs to either limit the emissions of GHG in the atmosphere, that's very clear. It needs to perhaps protect or enhance the GHG sinks and reservoirs. What do we mean by that? We mean like plant forest or reduce deforestation, because forest is acting as a sink or as a reservoir. It is sequestering GHG emissions. And so if you have a forestry project that is protecting or enhancing forestry that are acting as sink, then that could also be a mitigation project. It can also be more on the policy side, where you are talking about integrating of climate change concerns in the development objectives or building institutions, building capacity, strengthening policy frameworks, regulatory, legal frameworks, etc., or even research. And then, of course, it can also be about some development program that help you meet the obligation under the convention, which is, for instance, to produce a national communication or produce a biannual review or similar. So all of these activities could be marked as mitigation activities. If you want to score principal, then it means that the program has to explicitly and directly aim only to work towards these A, B, C, D, one of them. But you can also have a project that is on the side as a co-benefit or as one of the objectives delivering on some of this. This could be, for instance, a road sector program or a transport sector program, where besides strengthening the transport sector, there will also be an establishment of a climate section in the Ministry of Transport. That could be one where you are responding to target C here, and where there is a significant part of the program that is about climate change. But it's not only about climate change. It could also be a project where you are working on biodiversity, and through the biodiversity program, you are also enhancing a forestry, a habitat that acts as a sink or reservoir for GHG emissions. So that would also have a significant objective, but the main objective will be biodiversity protection, let's say. So there's a way of going about this. Yeah, let's move on to adaptation. Adaptation is a little bit different, and those of you who work on adaptation know that it's a lot more difficult to really distinguish adaptation efforts, because they are integrated in a lot of what we are doing. So broadly speaking, it's something that reduces the vulnerability of human or natural systems in relation to the climate effects. So it has to have a climate change adaptation objective explicitly described in the documentation, and it has to have some activities that are having some specific elements of living up to the definition above. So if you want to really score as principal, not just as significant, you have to have a real assessment of the risks, climate risk, the climate vulnerabilities, and the climate impacts. And I know in Panama, you have worked on this aspect of vulnerabilities and adaptation, and I believe even a vulnerability index or similar. So if you have a program that really tries to set out the context of the program in the context of climate risk, then that is important, and that could potentially score as principal. It can also be that, or it has to also be a program that intends to address these risks, address these vulnerabilities and impacts, and that is specifically talked about in the project documentation, probably even in the objective of this program or this project. And then, of course, it has to demonstrate a clear direct link between those risks and the activities that are put in place in a logical framework or whatever it may be. So that's if you want to score as principal. But as I mentioned, there can be a lot of adaptation elements in other programs. Programs about agriculture, programs about water. There can be a lot of side effects or good co-benefits about adaptation. And in some of them, if there is an expression of this, you could mark them as significant. Not as principal, but as significant. So here's an example of a scoring from a country. It's Germany providing some money to Morocco, and it's a solar power plant, it's a loan, and it's about energy generation and supply. If you take the OECD DAC sector, that would be what it belongs to. And so it scores 2 on mitigation because it's a principal objective. It's a solar power plant. It wants to reduce emissions, so it can score a 2. But you can imagine tons of other programs along the same lines. It could be an energy program that was not specifically about renewables and not specifically about reducing emissions. Then it might only score 1. Or it could be an adaptation program that was simply targeting resilience of a certain natural habitat, and then it might score 2 on adaptation, or it might score 1 if it was just a positive co-benefit. So this is the scoring that could take place in relation to the Rio Markers, and that you could also do in your own Ministry of Finance statistics. Try to look at the support that has been received and make sure that it's scored correctly. You can verify that with the OECD DAC statistics that I showed you how to get. Now, moving a little on to the next thing I said, which was a more deep assessment. Here we are talking about the Climate Public Expenditure and Institutional Review, CPEIR in short. UNDP has been very clearly trying to roll out this concept, and they have this guidebook, which is a quite important guidebook to access if you want to go down that road, and it has a lot of specific advice and recipes, and I think even it's possible to access some support from UNDP if you want to go down that road. And what I'm talking about now will be largely building upon the UNDP handbook. So as I said before, similar to other public expenditure reviews or public revenue reviews that are normally conducted by ministries of finance all over the world, this one is something which is focusing more on climate, and it has an added focus on policies and institutional setup. According to this methodology, there's a number of good objectives with this, why you should be doing it. But more specifically, it assists, as it is also about institutional setup, it assists you in improving the understanding of the roles and responsibilities of different institutions and how you will to coordinate and how you should implement climate actions. And of course, since it's about finance, it also quantifies the climate-related expenditures through a budgetary system and extra budgetary channels. It can be also, as I say, providing a tool for future tracking. So you could be using this review to put in place some more long-lasting instruments that will track and will produce some markers inside the budgetary system where you are tracking climate finance in the national delivery channels. Apart from that, it can also identify opportunities and constraints for integrating climate change, both at the national level and at the subnational level. What are the barriers for getting more climate finance in there, of getting more attention to climate finance in the public expenditures? So it can be a starting point to really strengthen a dialogue and a coordination across the government, of course, with finance and planning ministries in certain countries, but also with local government or subnational governments and private sector and civil society and even development partners if you want to do that. And then more on the adaptation side, it can also help really try to link a climate vulnerability assessment or climate vulnerability indexes, where you may look at geography, sector, population groups, and what is happening in terms of the responses. You can try to see whether there are really an attention to those that are most vulnerable with this tool. Are we really giving most attention to those regions of the country that are most vulnerable, to those population groups that are most vulnerable? And you can identify the gaps and make sure that you are, in future climate policies, making sure that you are protecting and benefiting the vulnerable groups and the vulnerable parts of the countries, and making sure you redirect budgets to that in the future. These are just some examples. In the guidebook, you can find a lot more examples for what could you use this for and what could be your attention point. Now, what is it actually? What are you going to do? So here I'm listing 6 steps from the guidebook, and they are pretty straightforward. You describe in a concept note, what are we trying to do? You consult a little bit on that. You also set up a steering committee that will run the whole process, of course, cross-institutional, and you also try to define some terms of reference. What will it include? What will it not include? How will it go about this? And then you, of course, try to consult this with everybody. Step 4 is where you actually do the analysis, and you are perhaps having first an inception phase where you are trying to figure out what would be the steps entailed in doing it, having some workshops where you consult, and then later on doing the in-depth work, resulting in a draft report that, of course, needs to be validated by everybody, maybe even translated. If it's in English, it has to be translated to Spanish in your case. And then, of course, step 6 is everything that comes after. What do you use this for? How do you use it to, as I just mentioned before, for instance, strengthen the tracking more permanently, or making sure the finance goes to those most in need in terms of climate effects, all of that. If we zoom in on step 4, you can take the other picture there with the 3 pillars, because step 4 is trying to explain what are the steps or the pillars of the actual analysis. So there's a pillar that is about the policy analysis, which is looking at the existing policy framework, what is in place, both at the national level, but also more at the sectoral level, maybe even at subnational level. It also looks at what are in place in terms of monitoring and evaluation. It also looks at what are your other tools that you have available in terms of assessments or procedures for vulnerability indexes or poverty assessments, etc. So it looks at the whole policy framework that are in place. Then you move on to the institutional analysis. Well, not move on, you may do some of this at the same time, of course. And there you're looking at the institutional expression of all of these policies. So what is happening in the institutions? How are budgets then allocated, especially for the climate area? What's the planning process for making sure climate is penetrating all of the ministries' actions? And how are you making sure that you have a coordinating mechanism in place? Many countries have a sort of council or a sort of coordinating mechanisms in the countries, and that's an assessment of that mechanism. There's also, as I mentioned before, some subnational government institutional arrangements and obligations. Here is where you are looking at that. And then, of course, the whole accountability part. It can be those that are evaluating, it can be the court, the constitutional court, it can be the auditor general, it can be a number of procedures and institutions you have in place in Panama that are on the accountability side. And then finally, of course, looking at the finance, looking at the expenditures, which is what we're talking about here, classifying that expenditure, weighing it. And when we talk about the weighing or weighting it, it is, as I said before, when I showed this weighting of the Rio marker, giving 0 to something that has no climate content, giving some percentage to whatever has a little bit of climate content or somewhat climate content, and then give 100% to that has solely a climate objective. So this weighting is quite important once you have done the expenditure analysis. Not everything that has climate change elements should be given 100% if it's only part of the element of that program or that project. You can also look at negative programs, things that are going against a climate objective. You can look at the fiscal instruments you have in place, subsidies, for instance, or taxes, or both in terms of the climate tax that are taxing the negative of climate change, but also incentives that encourage climate action. And then you can, of course, look at the more extended government side, all of the state-owned enterprises, all the public-private partnership that is engaged in. So that could be also part of the scope of the expenditure analysis. Now, how long time does all of this take? UNDP estimates 6 to 9 months to go from step 1 to step 4 and conclude step 4. And then after that, another 3 months to validation and finalization. And then, of course, step 6 can take years to take forward the recommendations. As I said, there's a permanent potential for a more permanent process. You could use this once you are going through all of this data classification, all this weighting. You could use it to establish some more permanent procedures that could be in the future used in a systematic manner. It can take years to establish such a more permanent system. It's not so easy to do, to install those markers, but it can be done. But in the meantime, you could, of course, conduct these reviews at a regular basis until you have such a more permanent system in place. So that's the outlook. But let's zoom in a little bit more. So what are you going to do? You will, in that expenditure review, try to look at, is this expenditure climate related or not? And then with this classification, you may use some standardized methodology to try to define that classification. You can use what UNDP is offering in this handbook, but also the World Bank have a number of expenditure review typologies that you could access. You could also invent your own definitions, and that would be a national policy objective typology that you could use in step 2. As I say, on the weighting, you may have a variety of ways to do this weighting. You could do it according to the climate relevance and have some sort of an index, as I was indicating, with a percentage saying if it is this much, it receives this much weight. But you can also try to look at it in a cost-benefit ratio. There might be some benefit in this, but there might also be some cost in this. And that would make it a little bit more complicated, but it could be something to consider when you are doing this classification. And then, of course, you could go even further and look at how could you overlay this with gender, with poverty, with a number of other social aspects. Could be geography or whatever else. So there's a number of ways to make it even more complicated, even more precise, you can say, in terms of what is the climate finance or climate support being spent on. Next slide, please. Here are some examples from the handbook where they are saying, okay, there could be a weighting more than 75 leading up to the 100%. You can see here is a list of some of the things that they could feel could have a clear primary objective of delivering specific outcomes that improve either resilience or mitigation. So it could be renewables or energy efficiency investments. It could be something that responds to a drought, a cyclone, a flooding, or something like that, especially if it has some added benefits for future extreme events. So if it's building more long-term resilience, that could be something. It could also be if it's addressing some climate-sensitive diseases, like where malaria is suddenly coming to a part of the country that didn't have malaria before because of the rise in temperature. Malaria is spreading in new geographic areas, and maybe there's some healthcare initiatives to address these climate-sensitive diseases, you can say, or waterborne diseases, for instance. So there's a number of examples here that could classify as giving it a weight of 75% or more. Next slide, please. We are going down to 50% or leading up to the 75. And here there are some that are perhaps a little bit more all-round projects, but which have a proper climate element, but perhaps mixed into an activity that is also about something else. So it could be an agroforestry project, but that will certainly have some mitigation side effects. It can be, as I mentioned before, biodiversity that could also have both mitigation and adaptation elements in their objectives, but not solely that. So there could be a number of projects that could have a co-benefit of climate change, of either adaptation or resilience or mitigation. Next one. Yes, here we are going further down. So that could be, as you can see, all the way down in marginal relevance, which could be short-term programs, even humanitarian relief that doesn't have any angle on climate. It can be education and health that doesn't integrate any climate change element. So there's a lot of programs that could not really demonstrate any climate relevance, and they should give quite low weight or zero. So this is a way you could use the weighting in the examples from the public expenditure and institutional revenue. I'm now moving on to a few examples from countries. I'm moving on to 2 examples, one from Maldives and one from Chile. And what I'm building this upon is their biannual update report. So this is first Maldives, which is, of course, a developing country, a least developed country, which is really struggling in terms of both the climate effects, but also struggling in terms of the institutional capacity to address climate effects. So what you will see here is a story that is not perfect at all, but a story that is quite real and a country that really has tried to deliver on this. So they submitted this first biannual update report in 2019. They are reporting on the financial support received, some capacity building, technology transfer. They are also trying to capture the support received for this particular report preparation and all of that. And they find that this is not really straightforward to do. They have gathered the financial data from Ministry of Finance, but also through donor and national budget and co-finance for the donor programs, but also data that has been checked with the data from line ministries. And then, of course, donor agreements, MOUs or programs where it says this donor has contributed this much, and also if there has been some in-kind support. That's what they are trying to capture. They have also tried to define adaptation versus mitigation. Again, not always that simple. And they're using, of course, the best practice and guidance provided by the consultative group of experts under the UNFCCC, and it's covered a range of years, so 5 years in total. So what have they done? They have looked at donor financing and trying to do that in the best possible manner. And what they have done is more or less a simple list of some of the projects that they have received funding for or are expecting to receive funding for. But here trying to capture mainly the things that has been received in this 5-year period. So they have a description of the project, start year, the end year, who has it been from, who has been the implementing entity on the government side. Has there been any other engagement of entities? So if you can see here, in the case of Germany, GIZ has been the implementing partner. Then they are trying to put a value on what they have received, what has been the grants, what has been the loans, has there been any co-finance, and then arriving at a final amount. And then they try to have a pro rata basis of trying to say what arrived in this period between 14 to 17. So it may mean that some of the programs, you can see the last one, is finalized in 18 or supposed to be finalized in 18, and they still have to report on it in 17. So they haven't taken the entire sum of the 115 million. They have taken some of it because that would be the pro rata basis of this 5-year period. So it's quite an effort to put this in place, but still it's only showing names and sums and some detail around the programs. So that's an example on the donor financing. If we look at what they have received, which was not finance, strictly speaking, but capacity building and technology transfer. They again try to describe that not with sums of money, but more with the description of the activity that they are doing, and trying also to say a little bit more about what kind of climate relevance is there, but also whether it's part of a multi-country program, because many countries are receiving finance as part of a larger regional support, and that of course needs to be captured as well. But here they're not trying to put a value on this capacity building or technology transfer. They are also not trying to put, you can say, a specificity on what technology has been transferred. They're simply trying to describe the activity. So not a lot of detail, and that's worthwhile to bear in mind. You can see here they are also mentioning some of the constraints they were facing, amongst others, the time constraint. So this was collected via tables that was submitted by the Annex 2 countries, meaning developed countries, and only those trainings that was recorded in the Ministry of Environment. So there could have been a lot more climate change trainings going on in Ministry of Agriculture, in Ministry of Water, Ministry of Energy, that could not have been recorded here because they simply didn't have the time and the means to get it out of those ministries, and they didn't have the overview. So it comes from tables submitted by the donors to the UNFCCC as Annex 2 countries, and then whatever they could record from their own ministry. So again, some limitations to this data because they simply didn't have the time and the capacity to do it any further than this way. Next slide. So here we are moving on to information on support needed. That would mean what do they need to get in the future, which is also what you need to report on in the CPEIR report, the biannual update report. And here you could say, oh, what do we need? We can make a shopping list right now on what we need. But again, they try to put in place certain methodologies to try to arrive at something meaningful here. They did it through a desk review of existing plans and policies and the NDC implementation plan. So trying to take it from what is already in place and say, what would we like to do? What have we already stated we need and we would like to do? And then, of course, they did some stakeholder consultations to identify also, are there additional key priorities or needs for the sectors? And this was then compiled and validated in a consultation with the sectors. And the table is divided into some more details, something about adaptation and resilience, something about mitigation and GSG work, and then the more capacity building side, the reporting and the enhanced transparency. They wanted to include financial numbers here. And you will know in an NDC, there's often a budget or an aim for a budget on all the actions in the NDC, including the actions that are depending or conditional on finance from the outside. So for some of this, they ought to have some numbers, but maybe they didn't have it on all of it. And it would be difficult in a short time frame to put a price tag on all of these activities and all of these elements that they would like, all of this support. So they didn't do that due to time constraints. But also you need to have certain expertise to make sure that the price tag you put on this is actually valid. And that is something we see from a lot of countries also in the NDC implementation plans, that once they get to the stage of really putting on the price tag, there's a need for more methodologies on how to do that. Tomorrow we will come to that because you will get from my colleague a bit more information around how you do costing and how you do cost-benefit analysis. So that's one way of making sure you get some more relevant, I call it price tags on some of the activities that you want to conduct. So if we summarize some of the lessons learned in Maldives, they say that there is climate finance information available in various entities in the country, but there is no systematic collection, no archiving, nobody is analyzing this information. And I would say often countries like Maldives, they get a consultant, maybe financed by UNEP or UNDP or somebody else, that comes, and for this particular report to the UNFCCC, that consultant go to all the ministry, try to collect whatever is available, and try to put together in a one-off report. So it's done as one report, as a snapshot in time, and there's not an institutionalized approach on how to collect it next time, how to make sure that this data is regularly delivered to that institution that is supposed to collect it and archive it and analyze it. You can also see here a number of other lessons learned: limited access to climate finance data, limited participation of line ministries. They need to improve the data access. They need to establish a separate system and link this with the national budget in order to make sure this is done in a better way. And they also need to address those inconsistencies that are there between different data, different publication and reports, even within some of the same institutions. They also are not yet tackling all the private sector part. And in Maldives, there's a big tourism sector, a lot of finance coming in also from the outside, in some of those big hotels and big investments in very exclusive resorts. So that is not at all targeted here. What are they doing on climate change? So there's a lot of lessons learned that one can take from Maldives. Now, when we are now moving on to Chile and to their fourth report, so you can see they have already an experience of producing several of these biannual update reports, where Maldives, it was the first report. So you can see there's really a different capacity, and you will also see that when we go further into the example. So in this case, we are looking at the specific chapter that looks at the needs and the support received. So the general methodology was to really use and build upon what is in the UNFCCC methodology, and focusing in this chapter specifically on what are the needs and what are the support. And they were using the definitions from all of this, and the methodology was really trying to understand all the sources, the financial, the capacity building, technical assistance, the technology transfer, and then analyzing all the gaps. And the support, they were also using these same categories, and they were also using all the guidance they can get from the parties, but also from some of the big multilateral sources of funding, such as the GEF and the Green Climate Fund, and I would say probably also the Inter-American Development Bank and others. Now, they know that it is quite important to, when you classify this, that you are classifying this based on the purpose of the need, not on the purpose of who is managing the resources or what kind of finance it is. So with that, I think they are trying to indicate that it's important to say that it is climate finance, regardless of whether it is recorded in Ministry of Agriculture or Ministry of Energy or Ministry of Transport or wherever it is recorded. It's not the administration of the resources that determines the need or the purpose. It is the purpose of the fund. So it's climate finance regardless of where it is. And with this in mind, they were looking at three areas: the policies, the programs, the projects, financial resources, in other words, that they receive, and then the capacity building, and then the technology transfer, very much in line with what the UNFCCC is requesting. So they were using this kind of structure. They were first saying, is this a public or private finance? And then sorting it by the area. If it was public, these were the 6 categories they were trying to sort it according to. If it was private, they were using a much more sector-oriented purpose code, you can say, or area code. And in the public sector, it was very much along the lines of what we've seen earlier, where you are talking about, is it something related to transparency and reporting? Is it mitigation activities, adaptation activities? Is it related to establishing a GHG inventory or facilitating negotiations or something different, which could be cross-cutting? Whereas the private sector, it was much more oriented towards the sector, as I mentioned before. Now, step 3 was about trying to establish where are the gaps, where are the barriers, where are the needs, what is the priority. So it was really trying to describe that in more detail. And the methodology to come about this data was really to make an initial survey with a form and a template to fill, then go out, meet all the stakeholders, both the public stakeholders and the private stakeholders, make sure the survey would be filled, and then compile out of that, filling the final tables of all of this data. And then, of course, having some quality assurance, validation, and all of that. And also often to have some peer review. Countries can ask for peer reviews through UNFCCC and get a peer review from other countries, or they can even institutionalize that themselves by contacting a neighboring country and ask, would you like to go through this report and see whether it looks solid? This was also about all of it about the needs side, how to define the needs and establish that. Next slide. Here we are looking more on the support received and the definitions they're using. So again, they are having these 2 categories: support for the preparation of national communications, or support received for a number of elements, and that is the financing of policies, programs, and projects for adaptation, for mitigation, or capacity building for adaptation, mitigation, or technology transfer for adaptation and mitigation. Again, they established a very logic methodology of how to create a register of this support that has been received, giving it an ID, giving it a status, saying, is it finished, is it done, is it on the way, when will it finish, etc. Then trying to survey this data, validate it, making sure you have the new data after validation. There would also be an element of clarification, of creating a data crossover, meaning verifying it with other sources. We are verifying it, for instance, with the OECD DAC Rio Marker data that I showed you in the beginning, and verify it with some of those who are implementing it. It can also be verified in stage 4 with private sector or from websites, and also link it to COP25 and the Ministry of Environment centralized data set. So you can see here, this is a country that is a lot more mature around how they are mapping this and how they are verifying it and how they are creating the entries. Now, I'm moving on to a final topic that is part of this, because this is a slightly side topic, you can say, but nevertheless important. Because we saw earlier in the case of Maldives that they were recording all the support they had been receiving, and they were supporting both the grants and the loans. And then they were putting it all together in one sum and then calculating that. So that would be one way of doing it, but there's another way of doing it where you are trying to assess something called a grant equivalent. Because when you have a loan, of course, needs to be paid back. It may be given on very good terms. Often it is given by a development partner on very concessional terms, meaning given in a way where it's better than the market terms. But there is a loan element nevertheless, and it has to be paid back. So because of this, OECD decided that they wanted to establish what is the grant equivalent of many of those loans that the partners or developed countries are providing. And they want to establish what is the level of concessionality. So the definitions that I'm stating here is that a grant equivalent is an estimate at today's value of money of how much is been given away over the life of a financial transaction or a project compared to if this transaction was taking place at market terms. So the grant equivalent is the grant element multiplied by the amount of money extended. So it's a way of expressing the generosity, you can say. Here, I'm also saying a grant, of course, has a grant element of 100%. It's a gift, it's a present, you are never going to pay it back. By contrast, if you have a loan and it's offered at the market terms, there's no present, there's no gift to you. It's simply market terms. You have to pay it all back according to the terms in the market. But if you're given a concessional loan, the lender has some element of generosity. And using this grant equivalent thinking gives a more accurate estimate of the effort or of the generosity element of the financial contribution. So that's why this is happening in order to, you can say, correct a table like we saw with Maldives, where loan and grants is put in one big pot. But this would be a more correct picture using this grant equivalent methodology. Now, there's a variety of ways to calculate this. There's not a full agreement on the approaches on how to do this. So I'm giving here some links to some examples. There's a link from UK, from IFC, but also a link from the Green Climate Fund. And in the Green Climate Fund, it is an Excel-based tool. So I think that's quite interesting. You put in the values, and I can show you just on the next slide. It's not here itself, but you put in the values here, and then it will calculate everything for you. So if you know some of these features, what is the tenure? Here it's a GCF loan, but you could even do it for your own sake, use their grant calculator. So what is the tenure, meaning what is the year of the loans? How many years is the loan over? Is it 30-year loan or 20-year loan or whatever? The grace period, meaning the period until you have to pay the loan back. What is that? And also the repayment type, the interest rate, etc. So all of this is something you will enter, and with that, all those entries, you will get a value, and that would show you what is the grant element or grant equivalent of some of the finance you are receiving, which is not grants. And I'm sure you are receiving a lot of finance, for instance, from the Inter-American Development Bank, which is in the form of loans. So it's quite important to not calculate it as a grant, because that would not be fair either on you nor on them. So this is something to bear in mind if you want to be even more precise, and even more precise than we saw in the case of the Maldives. Now, I think I will stop almost here by just showing you some, in the end, these are some of the requests from UNFCCC, some of the tables they are asking for. So this is the way UNFCCC is asking it. But of course, this is not just about reporting to the UNFCCC. It's an important purpose, but as I said, there are many other purposes. And if you want to institutionalize tracking in your system, in your financial books, so to speak, of the country, then you need much more than just putting in data in such a table. Now, I thank you very much for your patience. It's a long presentation, I know. I hope it's useful and that it can be relevant also to the Panama context of where you are. And I'm more than ready to receive questions or comments from you. And I hope I can answer in the best possible way. I'm putting now on my headphones in order to get the English translation. So you can always ask your question in Spanish. The interpreter will try to help me understand the question. So thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Merete, por la presentación tan interesante que nos acabas de compartir. Ahora quisiera empezar con la sesión de preguntas y respuestas. Si me dan un segundo, puedo compartir mi pantalla. Pues hemos recibido algunas preguntas por parte de la audiencia. De todas formas, les pediría que si tienen más preguntas pueden seguir compartiéndolas por el chat o me las pueden enviar a mí directamente. Y por ahora tengo 3 preguntas. Voy a empezar con la primera pregunta y es en relación al OECD DAC Rio Markers System. Merete, ¿cuáles son las principales limitaciones que dirías que podemos encontrar en este sistema?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yes, as I mentioned earlier, the data set that you will find in the Rio Marker system has certain limitations. Even though it's constantly improved, it has certain limitations. And as I said before, it will only be from the OECD countries because that's the only ones who are obliged to report to the system. So countries which are not members of the OECD are not obliged to report to the system. And that means, as I said before, countries that are given funds to other countries but are not OECD members will not be recorded there. As I mentioned, China is a good example of a country which is not an OECD member. And we know China is very active at least in Africa, but I could believe also in Latin America. And they would not be found necessarily unless they are given the data to OECD. Another tricky part is the finance that goes through the multilateral funds. So let's say my country, Denmark, we would be reporting both of the finance we give to a range of countries all over the world, and we would give details on what are we giving bilaterally to those countries, also giving to regionally programs where it goes to perhaps a range of countries in Latin America. But then we will also record the finance we give to the World Bank, to the Inter-American Development Bank, or Asian Development Bank, or to the Green Climate Fund, or to JEF, or to others. Now, this finance, of course, we are reporting as a country, as an OECD member country, as a nation state, you can say. But the funds themselves, World Bank, is also reporting to OECD. And so there's a real need to clean that data and to make sure that it is capturing, not counting twice the same money, because the money that is then channeled to World Bank would then be counted again when World Bank is channeling it to, let's say, Ethiopia or to Sudan or to something else. So there is a challenge because you have to clean that data and make sure it's not calculated twice. Also, as I mentioned, this whole thing about making sure that data that is or finance that is reported as loans or finance that is reported as guarantees, let's say, if there's a credit guarantee fund or something like that, that finance should not, as we saw before, be calculated as a present, because of course some of it has to be paid back. Or if it's a guarantee, maybe this guarantee will never be released because there's no need for the guarantee. It's like an insurance. So when you come into a lot of other financial instruments, there is a danger that that kind of finance are not calculated in the best possible way, because it is tricky to make sure that it is reflecting fully the element that is concessional, so to speak, that is a grant, the grant element of such finance. And it would be unfair to let's say, do like the Maldives say, calculate a loan as if it was a grant, because of course Maldives have to pay it back. So there's a lot of these limitations that one have to really be cautious around when you're using the statistics from the Rio Markers. You have to be quite cautious. The other part is, of course, if somebody is different countries put different weighting, that some countries calculate something 40%, another country calculates something 60%, then you cannot really compare. One program may be weighted differently by different countries, and that's also not giving the correct picture. So many limitations, but also the best available data set as it is for the time being.
Muchas gracias, Merete, por esta respuesta tan detallada. Otra pregunta que hemos recibido también en relación con el OECD DAC Rio Market System y parecida a la pregunta anterior es la siguiente. ¿Cómo nos aseguramos que todas las instituciones estamos clasificando las inversiones climáticas de mitigación y adaptación de manera alineada?
Again, a very good question. I hope it's also informative for you guys in Panama. And that is exactly the question when you go about such a reporting, like you saw in the example of Maldives and the example of Chile. Because you saw the example of Maldives, more least developed countries, a first report, it's very tricky. And I'm sure that when they have interacted with the ministries and tried to gather this data, that there has not necessarily been 100% consistent definition of what is the kind of finance you need to report and how much should you report of it, etc. Whereas when you saw Chile, it was a little bit more detailed on how they go about it, the steps of marking and classifying and verification and categorizing it, etc. Much more detailed. And of course, also a country with a much higher capacity to actually do this. So the key is to get these systems, these methodologies in place before you go about anything, and then work with the sectors, with the institutions that has to do the reporting. You can get, as I showed in the beginning, the inspiration from the Rio Marker, methodology, because the Rio Marker methodology, that's where they have said, what is a mitigation project? It's a mitigation project if it's reducing GHG, if it is advancing and promoting the sinks. So there were certain definitions you could go about. And so that's what you need to look for in a program. So if you're looking at the National Agricultural Promotion Program, you have to look for, is there anything in this program that will be reducing CO2? Yes, no. Is there anything in this program that is enhancing the sink? Yes, no. So you have certain, at least guiding elements from the Rio Markers you could go for, and you could put into your system in order to make sure that that it lives up to a coherent and consistent definition of what is mitigation, what is adaptation.
Muchas gracias, Merete, por la respuesta. Y otra pregunta que hemos recibido hasta ahora es la siguiente. ¿Qué puede utilizarse de lo presentado de Maldivas y Chile para mapear el apoyo climático?
I think you can use them as examples. As I said, not perfect examples, but nevertheless examples. I would think in the Maldives, it shows you perhaps how difficult it is, how tricky it is for a country with low capacity to go about this. For Chile, you can see that they had a very structured approach, building upon the guidance from the UNFCCC, breaking down what are the elements of the data we need to get, how do we need to record the data, what kind of questions do we need to ask for when we are recording the data. And in doing that, really having quite a systematized methodology. Maybe not perfect, I don't know, but certainly a lot more systematized in terms of breaking down the data and breaking down the criteria of the data, breaking down how to go about gathering that data and verifying it, etc. With Chile, you didn't see the actual tables, but of course, you are always welcome to go and access all of these biannual update reports. They are available on the UNFCCC, and you can gain inspiration from those reports. Those reports are made to report to the convention, but you can also use them as an inspiration for building your own system to track climate finance, whether you want to report it to the convention or not. It can still be used as an inspiration. I hope you if you want to know more, that you get back to us, and that we have a colleague here in the UDP, who has worked for many years in the Chile ministry and have been responsible exactly for these kind of elements. So I'll be happy to put you in touch with him if you want to know more.
Muchas gracias, Merete, por la respuesta. Y por ahora no hemos recibido más preguntas, así que voy a dar por finalizado esta sesión de preguntas y respuestas. Siguiendo la agenda que presenté al inicio, después de esta sesión de preguntas y respuestas tenemos una pausa, pero calculamos que iba a durar más la presentación de Merete, así que perdónenme por las horas porque voy a tener que modificarlo. Ahora mismo son aquí en Copenhague son 5:33, así que esto lo voy a modificar y vamos a tener una pausa de 10 minutos, empezando pues ahora a las 7:33 y volveremos a las 10:45. Voy a modificar este slide y en este momento de pausa es cuando vamos a crear las diferentes sesiones de grupo en formato de breakout rooms y se les va a asignar a ustedes de forma aleatoria. En estas sesiones de actividades de grupo se van a discutir las dos preguntas que pueden ver ustedes aquí en la parte derecha de esta presentación. Así que bueno, les veo nuevamente a las 10:45. Voy a modificar esta diapositiva para que lo tengan como referencia. Muchas gracias y nos vemos en 10 minutos. Hola a todos. Y bueno, estoy viendo que los participantes se están uniendo poco a poco. Les quería agradecer a todos por su participación en las diferentes sesiones de grupo. Y ahora, como comentamos en la agenda al inicio, los moderadores van a poner en común los diferentes puntos más importantes que se han hablado en las sesiones de grupo. Voy a esperar un poco más mientras se van uniendo los diferentes participantes. Vamos a dar un par de minutos. Y Jorge va a ser el primer moderador que va a presentar los resultados más importantes de su sesión de grupo. Pero aún voy a dar un minuto más mientras se van uniendo todos los participantes. Vale, pues Jorge, si quieres empezar con los resultados de tu sesión de grupo, por favor.
Hola, sí, de acuerdo. Voy a compartir mi pantalla. Sí se ve mi pantalla, ¿cierto, Begonia?
Se ve.
Listo, bueno. Entonces, aquí nosotros estábamos discutiendo, fue una discusión bastante buena. Algunos estábamos discutiendo por mensaje, otros estábamos discutiendo en voz. Lo que estamos haciendo aquí es clasificar las principales conclusiones que tenemos de las dos preguntas. Después clasificamos los que son retos y cómo superar estos retos, ¿verdad? Lo que empezamos a comentar en el grupo es que hace mucha falta un manual de las fuentes de financiamiento climático que se clasifiquen estas organizaciones y requisitos para acceder a las fuentes de cambio climático, los tipos de recursos y de mercados. Y también estamos hablando, pues, por ejemplo, que hay unas organizaciones que dan financiamiento climático a mercados que son más grandes o a programas nacionales, pero a veces también queremos acceder a mercados más pequeños, en comunidades más pequeñas, y también queremos saber, tener acceso a información, quiénes también dan financiamiento o donaciones o programas a este tipo de organizaciones, ¿verdad? Por otra parte, es muy importante, como se discutía, tener un reporte de seguimiento en mi ambiente. Bueno, tener un reporte de seguimiento, como hablábamos, es importante tener el MRB de todos estos proyectos de financiamiento. También asegurar que los requerimientos y capacidades estén al 100 y que se involucren instituciones como el Ministerio de Economía y Finanzas en en este tema de decidir, de etiquetar cambio climático, financiamiento climático.
Taking the decisions. And the focal point in climate change does have something to do.
Y validar la información con las fuentes multilaterales que apoyan los programas y proyectos de Panamá. Aquí pues es uno de los retos importantes, o sea, realmente tener una información validada con todas las diferentes fuentes multilaterales. Dentro de los retos principales que estábamos hablando son que realmente se necesita contar para poder acceder a un sistema de financiamiento climático en Panamá es con el capital humano y las capacidades necesarias, ¿sí? Pero con la máxima precisión posible, decían, que se tengan sistemas apropiados, ya plataformas avanzadas, que tengan la información actualizada en la nube, ¿no? Como por ejemplo, uno de los colegas comentaba que está, bueno, trabajando en información que es forestal o de información geográfica y esto se actualiza en la nube. Este tipo de plataformas más avanzadas, pues, que también estén avanzándose en financiamiento climático. El compromiso institucional para capacitar al personal que estará involucrado para conocer estas definiciones y también evaluar las estructuras actuales para la gestión de proyectos y cuáles involucran el financiamiento climático. Este es un reto porque hay diferencias pues entre el compromiso institucional de algunos ministerios y queremos alinear y tener simplemente asegurado este tema. Uno de los retos principales, la interpretación del financiamiento climático que no está unificada. Entonces, por ejemplo, si hacemos un enfoque en las poblaciones o ecosistemas más vulnerables al cambio climático, esto es uno de los retos que a veces todavía no se da en la práctica, que como comentábamos, algunos proyectos que suceden en las comunidades de salud, de temas que suceden a nivel local, que todavía no se catalogan como financiamiento climático, como de vulnerabilidad social urgente, pues aquí urge también tener una capacidad de decirles o ayudarles a interpretar esto como financiamiento climático y tener una alineación a los diferentes niveles, ¿verdad? Que, bueno, este es el reto, asegurar la coordinación entre distintos niveles de gobierno para realmente tener, pues, en la misma página lo que es financiamiento climático y lo que no es, lo que sí entró, para no dejar de fuera estos proyectos. Un tema que se comentó que es crucial es crear las alianzas estratégicas. Al menos 2 participantes lo enfatizaron, que necesitamos crear esas alianzas estratégicas que además de compartir información pueden vincularse, ¿sí? Entre instituciones o el sector privado y público para poder intercambiar esta información y asegurar que estos temas de tener un MRB completo, tener una sistematización no falle, pues, ¿sí? Estar actualizados. Entonces, crear estas alianzas también con las fuentes multilaterales, que son las que están enviando mucha información de este tipo, pues es importante para que a nivel local se cuente con la misma información. Y pues esto es como superar los retos, ¿no? Que se comentaba también. O sea, teniendo estas alianzas estratégicas entre las instituciones vinculadas, se puede llegar a superar más fácilmente estos retos y se puede pues acceder a los recursos de una forma más fácil y como las comunidades o los proyectos que no están mapeados o que no están en el sistema pueden agregarse poco a poco, como en el ejemplo que no nos pase como en el ejemplo de Maldivas, pues que hay muchos proyectos y muchos financiamientos que todavía no están o no sabemos cómo los clasificamos o simplemente los datos no están disponibles, ¿verdad? Y por último, hacer un mapeo de todos los proyectos y programas de financiamiento climático, que bueno, es de lo que se trata este tema, ¿verdad? Y darle seguimiento, ¿verdad? Cada 6 meses, que es un buen, a mí se me parece un buen plazo. Este mapeo de los proyectos y programas, pues como son a varios niveles y entre varias instituciones, a mí me parece que es el reto máximo, pero es la forma de superar y es lo que se puede lograr con lo que estamos trabajando del sistema MRB y de esta creación de capacidades, ¿verdad? De fortalecimiento. Entonces, esas son las principales conclusiones de nuestro grupo. Voy a volver a ustedes.
Muchas gracias, Jorge, por estos resultados y puntos tan importantes. Me gustaría ahora darle la palabra a Belén para que nos comparta los puntos que se han discutido en su sesión de grupo. Por favor, Belén.
Sí, voy. ¿Me confirman si se ve la pantalla?
Sí, se ve. Si la puedes poner, por favor, en modo completo.
Okay.
Vale, gracias.
Vale. Ok, dentro del grupo, creo que éramos el grupo número 2, dentro de los principales retos que sí lograron identificar, por ejemplo, para el tema del reporte, para Panamá, tenemos uno, era el tema de la falta de unificación de información e intercambio de esta información relacionada a las inversiones climáticas. De hecho, el equipo menciona que varias entidades manejan distintos formatos de reporte de información. De repente el Ministerio de Ambiente tiene un formato, el sistema del MEF tiene otro, las organizaciones no gubernamentales tienen otro formato, y esto dificulta al final este sistema de MRV a entidades internacionales, o por lo menos a nivel de Panamá, de país, pues. Entre las soluciones que menciona el equipo, pues está la creación o la unificación de toda esta información, tanto en el sector público, privado, y al mismo tiempo también crear un sistema de alianza estratégico para que se pueda gestionar o dar este intercambio de información tanto interinstitucional e intrainstitucional. Cuestión de que pueda ser o sea, que todos los sistemas manejen el mismo formato de reporte y que pueda este mismo ser presentado a entidades internacionales al momento de reportar nuestros fondos. Otra de nuestros retos que se identificaron fue la falta de sensibilización y conocimiento en temas relacionados de cambio climático, porque es importante, y también la existencia de fondos de inversión climática. Muchas entidades no conocen que existen fondos de inversión climática, y entre las soluciones que menciona el equipo, pues está fortalecer estas capacidades de financiamiento climático, de cambio climático, desde la planificación de un proyecto o de un programa, cuestión de que pueda ayudar al momento de que se cree un portafolio de los distintos fondos de inversión que maneja el país, ¿verdad? Tanto que sea de aporte externo o de aporte local, ¿verdad? Y en caso tal de que estos fondos sean de origen transversales. Recuerden que hay algunos fondos que, pues, como lo mencionó la compañera en la sesión, algunos fondos pues algunos proyectos tienen diferentes fondos para financiamiento. Otra parte pues es insertar este conocimiento dentro de las gestiones de las instituciones privadas, públicas, ¿verdad? Que manejen este tipo de temáticas. Otro de los retos que logramos identificar fue el tema de la dificultad de la transversalización del cambio climático en los sectores importantes de nuestro país, llámese sector socioeconómico, y nuestra solución sería fortalecer y sensibilizar ¿verdad? En estas temáticas a nivel nacional, a todo a nivel nacional, y al mismo tiempo, pues, identificar y articular la participación de lo que son los stakeholders o los actores claves y los tomadores de decisiones que puedan gestionar de forma adecuada la relación entre la temática de financiamiento y el cambio climático. Otro de los retos que se logró identificar pues, fue la parte de la falta de criterios y de una taxonomía no universal, pero sí que pueda ser unificada a nivel nacional para clasificar e identificar cuando un programa o un proyecto o un fondo está relacionado al cambio climático, si es de tema de adaptación, mitigación o transversal. Y la solución que se le da para esto o cómo superarlo sería crear un sistema de clasificación de estos proyectos, llámese tipo manual, llámese algún tipo de taxonomía regulada que permita entonces regular estos programas o estos fondos. Y bueno, para terminar con esta pregunta, dentro de nuestro desafío país tenemos que no contamos con una buena base de datos que nos permita pues reportar ante la convención el tema del financiamiento climático y poder de esta forma identificar dónde están nuestras debilidades como país. Y la otra parte muy importante que también está es que al momento de aplicar un sistema de reporte, es que este sistema de reporte que se aplica a nivel nacional pueda ser el más acertado ante estas entidades que se tienen que reportar y verificar, llámese convención, llámese cualquier tipo de entidad de financiamiento que solicite verificar o reportar cómo se gestionan sus fondos. Y en la siguiente pregunta, el equipo mencionó y recalcó algunos puntos importantes de los distintos ejemplos o marcos, como fue el marcador de Río. De hecho, les pareció importante adoptar el tema de la columna de descripción de cómo se gestionan los fondos hacia eventos de temáticas, llámese vulnerabilidad y riesgo climática actuales, como lo es el de marcadores de Río. El segundo, pues identificar si el financiamiento climático y cómo se va a brindar de acuerdo a principios y de qué manera esto está aportando a la meta de acción climática que tenga el país. Y la otra parte es actualizar periódicamente esta data suministrando de acuerdo a los inventarios de gases de efecto invernadero, los bosques, humedales y biodiversidad que se generan a nivel nacional. Dentro del sistema de CPEIR, también pues, fue importante o recalcaron el sistema que tiene para sistematizar los fondos, ya sea de origen de préstamo y el porcentaje que tienen que pagar de acuerdo a la fecha de pago, igual la clasificación de las datas y las políticas fiscales que contribuyen a la gestión de estos fondos de inversión climática. Y bueno, por último, nos pareció también importante adoptar el sistema que tiene Chile de presentar en sus informes bienales lo que es la identificación y el reporte de los fondos de financiamiento climático de acuerdo a la acción climática que tienen, también de acuerdo a cómo estos fondos contribuyen a sus cumplimientos de metas de acción climática o compromisos, llámese GNDC, llámese compromisos de Acuerdo de París, entre otros. Al mismo tiempo, la aplicación de los formatos tabulares para la matrícula y el registro de los fondos de proyectos, de acuerdo a, como les mencioné, el tema de los compromisos nacionales. Y bueno, esto fue lo que rescatamos dentro de nuestro equipo. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias a ti, Belén, por estos puntos de vista que nos sugieres y por las soluciones que se proponen. Y ahora, por último, me gustaría escuchar los resultados del grupo de Janet. Por favor, Janet, si nos compartes vuestros puntos más importantes.
Sí, ¿pueden ver mi pantalla?
Sí, si la pones en completo, por favor. Gracias.
Sí, bien, en nuestro grupo pudimos ir identificando cuáles son los retos para el mapeo y seguimiento del financiamiento climático primordialmente, y bueno, estas fueron como los highlights de lo que pudimos conversar. Bueno, entre estas está que las capacidades disponibles para el manejo de los mapeos, creación de normativas, fortalecimiento institucional y la información diseminada. Estos son como uno de los principales retos que se identificaron. También está el enfoque que debemos enfocar los presupuestos hacia el cambio climático, aunque ya se han identificado en otras temáticas, como bien lo resaltaron del MEF, que han logrado identificar cuáles son estos proyectos de innovación, ciencia y tecnología, y que bueno, ahora tenemos el reto de poder hacer lo mismo para el cambio climático. También se destacó, y creo que se ha mencionado anteriormente, que no se cuenta con un banco de proyectos que permita hacer estas clasificaciones nuevas, o sea, que se adapte a los nuevos requerimientos, nuevas necesidades, y entonces se buscaría que se adopten estos nuevos campos que permitan clasificar o identificar estos componentes de cambio climático. También se resaltó el poder identificar cuáles son estos proyectos de adaptación, mitigación, y también la adaptación de herramientas tecnológicas que permitan capturar estos datos y que faciliten el uso de la data para la toma de decisiones. También se resaltó que existen los retos de llevar todas estas soluciones a los territorios o municipios, o sea, fuera de la ciudad capital. También que ahora se han adoptado nuevas medidas, como fue la creación de una nueva Dirección de Desarrollo Territorial, que bueno, que busca primordialmente este tema, el de llevar las soluciones a estos territorios más alejados. Entre las soluciones que se presentaron estaba el de fortalecer las capacidades técnicas, también el de el apoyo en cooperaciones entre las instituciones, y bueno, también como alternativas para superar todos estos que se plantearon, está el de trabajar en nuevas metodologías para llevar las temáticas de cambio climático, modernizar los métodos actuales de política pública asumiendo los nuevos retos y guías específicas para la evaluación de proyectos de sectores prioritarios. También se tienen proyectos macro que involucran, en los que se han involucrado especialistas en cambio climático. Por ejemplo, en la actualidad se tiene un proyecto de ordenamiento territorial y se han venido apoyando con expertos de ambiente desde la parte técnica. Y esto como parte de los apoyos entre instituciones que se manejan en la actualidad, pero que se resalta que deben ser fortalecidos. En cuanto a la segunda pregunta, si bien ellos lograron identificar que es un reto para el país, sería muy interesante poder validar la información con la que ya contamos y poder compararlas con otras agencias que han venido trabajando los temas de cambio climático, como son los del BID y a otras agencias multilaterales. También los ejemplos reflejan los trabajos que se deben realizar en aspectos de bases de datos, metodologías y ayudan a inventariar los requerimientos de las áreas que se deben seguir trabajando. Esto en referencia a los ejemplos que presentaron los expositores, que son y deben ser tomados como buenas referencias y que estas deben ser acogidas o pueden ser mejoradas o adaptadas para las situaciones y el contexto nacional. Se deben profundizar en las herramientas presentadas y buscar formas de adaptarlas y ajustarlas al contexto. Incluir otras instituciones del sector privado, resaltando cómo fue el trabajo que ha venido haciendo Chile. Y se mencionó también que se debe seguir fortaleciendo los apoyos entre instituciones. También el intercambio sur-sur, entre otras, para identificar y validar puntos de mejora aplicables al contexto nacional. Esto de lo que pude extraer de las conversaciones que se tuvieron en la sala.
Muchísimas gracias, Janet, y también gracias a los otros moderadores, Jorge y Belén. Antes de finalizar esta sesión, quería comentarles que, bueno, hay muchos puntos en común entre los diferentes resultados que se han presentado y también hay espacio para complementariedad. Entonces, si consideran ustedes relevante, quieren comentar algo de los diferentes puntos que se han presentado, Jorge, Belén o Janet. Si tienen algún punto que os gustaría comentar, que crean que es relevante. Y si no,
bueno,
adelante.
podría adicionar que, bueno, hay muy buena disposición por parte de los diferentes actores nacionales para ir aprendiendo y acogiendo todas estas terminologías nuevas que de repente desde nuestros diferentes contextos no se solían acoger, como eran los temas de cambio climático, pero hay una gran disposición para ir mejorando, ir aprendiendo sobre la marcha, y eso es súper valioso. Igual el tema de cambio climático y este tema de financiamiento climático es bastante nuevo y definitivamente nos toca ir aprendiendo de los países que ya han ido implementando estos nuevos temas e ir mejorando sobre la marcha.
Muchísimas gracias, Janet, por el comentario.
Vale.
Jorge, ¿quieren comentar algo?
Sí, bueno, por mi parte, principalmente creo que, bueno, agradecerles al equipo que fueron realmente muy participativos. Y lo otro que, bueno, recalcar el hecho de, como mencionan, el tema de cambio climático, digámoslo así, en el país es algo, por decirlo así, nuevo que se habla. No todas las instituciones reaccionan de forma asertiva de repente al momento de que hablamos de cambio climático, y por tal motivo es necesario capacitar, sensibilizar de una forma intensa en qué es el cambio climático y las repercusiones que este tema pues va a tener tanto a nivel social como a nivel económico, ¿verdad? Y como lo menciona mi compañera Janet, en efecto el tema de financiamiento climático es algo aún mucho más nuevo que el tema de cambio climático, y es completamente un mundo. Sin embargo, es necesario que para nosotros como país podamos realmente estar en la misma página de las acciones que se van a tomar con este tema de cambio climático, cómo reportar los fondos. Más que nada, rescato eso que mencionan mis compañeras, bueno, los participantes, de unificar este sistema de reporte, por decirlo así, de los fondos de las acciones climáticas, que todas las entidades que se encarguen de ejecutar o solicitar estos fondos puedan tener el mismo formato tabular, y más que nada que este sistema de formato de registro pueda ser el más acertado ante estas entidades de financiamiento, y también pues el tema de las entidades que regulan estos fondos, como el tema de la convención, porque de repente Panamá puede tener un sistema de registro, pero tal vez no es el más, por decirlo así, el más asertivo, el que quiere o el que le parece funcional a estas entidades. Entonces creo que tenemos que comenzar por ahí más que nada, que se pueda crear un sistema de registro lo más completo, lo más acertado, y partir de este hecho dentro de nuestras instituciones y comenzar a registrar. Puede ser un trabajo un poco tedioso, efectivamente, y de repente muchos lo verán como que es un poco más de trabajo. Sin embargo, es algo que es necesario para poder que nuestro país pueda cumplir con la meta de transparencia climática, y que podamos realmente estar poco a poco preparados para los futuros riesgos que vayan a surgir en nuestro país, pues más que nada. Entonces, sí rescato esto de lo que tanto lo que me presentó Janet y lo que presentó el licenciado Jorge, por lo menos el tema de unificación de información va estratégicamente con el tema de alianzas entre las instituciones, y el tema del financiamiento climático, el sistema de reporte también va de la mano con que esto pueda estar realmente, por decirlo así, legalizado y unificado en todo el país.
Muchas gracias, Belén, por estos puntos. Y ahora me gustaría darle la palabra a Merete, que nos va a comentar unos aspectos finales para tener en cuenta. Merete, por favor.
Thank you very much, and thank you very, very much for this feedback and directly feedback also on the presentation. I think as you rightly put it, it shows a very high sense of willingness and commitment to actually find the solutions to addressing climate change and to making sure that you make the full potential out of the climate finance which is available to you, but also that you are, as you were saying, on a journey, first understanding the whole essence of climate affects both the adaptation side and the mitigation side, and then on the top of it, finance. I can fully understand that that is a tall order. I just want to highlight a few of the things that was said, which was also highlighted by Janet and Belen. But I think you have some good suggestions in terms of this wish to unify your data systems. It could be unifying a lot of different data, also data for CO2 inventories, which also has to be reported to the UNFCCC. But certainly in this case, when we talk about finance, having a unified system to mark and to track the finance is, of course, of essence, and to have a classification, a taxonomy that really everybody understands, so that you are able to, at the source, make sure that it is getting that mark or getting that tracking. And if it can happen at an electronic platform, which was talked about in one of the groups, I think that would be excellent. But even doing it without an electronic platform is an opportunity as you are journeying towards the more perfect system. I think also it is interesting to hear that all of you have in your mind both the subnational level, the vulnerabilities of certain areas and geographical regions, but also vulnerabilities of certain communities. I think that's commendable, because that's important to have that in mind from the very beginning. I also think it's worthwhile noting that you have a good perspective on getting strategic alliances even beyond government, with private sector and civil society and the donors and everybody else. I think that's really also important. I want to say that on our side, we have a lot of data and a lot of other countries where we are working on some of the same issues. Not all the cases are with climate finance, but a lot of them are about institutionalizing climate data, whether it's climate data on CO2 emissions or similar, or climate data on vulnerabilities, or climate data on programs that are being addressed, or climate data on finance. So we have many examples, and if you are interested in more examples, we certainly can uncover some of those examples for you. In some of them, the whole formalization is quite important, that there's a formalized agreement between the ministries, between even subnational entities, local government, about how you want to share data and deliver data, and perhaps deliver data to a central institution. And that can be anything from the National Bureau of Statistics to a Ministry of Environment, or Ministry of Finance, or Ministry of Planning. But we have many examples of that kind of institutionalization that we are very happy to share with you. And the South-South learning, which was mentioned, is exactly what we believe in, because it is by seeing another example and by hearing somebody else who is working on this and who are meeting challenges on their way and also overcoming these challenges, that's how you also get the necessary inspiration. Now, I just want to go to this take-home point slide, because that was just to say what we felt we were sharing with you today is, of course, some information about the global database, what are some of the global information which is available, mainly from OECD, and that can be maybe the very basic way to map the support you are receiving, and maybe to do some cross-referencing in your local context. Is this really true, what you can see in the database, or do you have a different picture locally? The other thing, advice and take-home point is, of course, to access any tools that are available. Pick and choose, as you are talking about. Pick maybe the definitions from the Rio Marker, but the system to go about it from the UNFCCC guidance, or from a very deep expenditure review. Pick and choose any of the tools that you think are relevant and that you feel could be helpful for you. It is important to decide not just on definition, but also this about the weights, because if you don't, you will calculate apples and pears in one big mess, and then it will not really give you good data. So one of the things that is important is to determine how will you calculate the weights. And then, as I said, lastly, learn from other countries' experience. You can look up all of these biannual reports, and you can also reach out to countries and exchange ideas. You can do that in the COP, if you're going to Glasgow, or if you are sitting on distance from Glasgow, then to do it through side events and other events. And we are certainly available if you want more advice on how to go about this whole institutionalization, unification, and how to formalize some of the elements that needs to be put in place to have a solid system. But thank you very much for today. It has been a pleasure to meet all of you and to hear about your specific context, and I hope this has been useful to you. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias, Merete, por estas observaciones finales. Y bueno, hemos llegado al final de este seminario y me gustaría agradecer a Merete, Jorge, Belén y Janet por las presentaciones informativas e interesantes, al igual que al público por su activa participación. Esperamos que las presentaciones y discusiones sean útiles para todas las partes interesadas e involucradas en el financiamiento climático. Gracias por su atención y les deseo un buen día desde Copenhague. Hasta mañana.